Hello class, happy Friday. Today we're going to be going over a topic. So we spent the whole beginning of this year talking about ecosystem, essentially ecology, so animals, animal behavior, populations, communities, etc. Now we're going to move on to something a little bit different. The explanation, we're sort of working backwards here. It's like, where did all this come from? Like, where did this sort of originate from? How did these rules and laws and these animals, how did we get to that point? So this next section is all about evolution. It's used to be a very controversial topic, and now I'm allowed to teach it to you guys because a lot of these things have just been sort of uncovered, discovered, verified in the last few decades. So this one, again, I'm going to separate this video into different standards. So talking about evolution standard 1, and I sort of reworded these so they're a little bit more understandable to you all. So evolution to standard 1, you need to know what the traditional views are and that they were actually challenged. Whoa. So first of all, if we want to just sort of this overarching theme, something called descent with modification. So some of you may not know what descent with modification means and why do we keep talking about it. This was Darwin's original idea, saying that we all descended from the same ancestor or some original being that was the very first organism, and since then we've all descended with some sort of modification, or those of you that like X-Men, with some mutations, ever since we've descended from the same ancestor. Evolutionary change, the theme of this is that evolutionary change is based on the interactions between populations and their environment. So remember we talked about populations and ecosystems, so based on our interaction with us and our environment, we have created adaptations or inherited characteristics to increase fitness. Not fitness like I'm buff or like P90X, but I'm saying that we've gotten adaptations so that we are able to survive and create offspring. So the definition of evolution for this class is change over time in the genetics of a certain population. So this part, it's not exactly the most exciting part because it's sort of a history lesson, but it's sort of interesting and you need to know all these guys anyway. First one, you may have heard of Aristotle. He was the very, very, very first person to talk about life forms and arranging them. Aristotle, he came up with something called scala naturae, which means he wanted to arrange all the life forms, all the animals, plants, any organisms, and organize them in scale from least complex to most complex. So Aristotle was sort of the first one to try to even think about this stuff. Biblically, the Old Testament sort of had their own version of it, and it was accepted for a while, creationism, meaning that God created all these species just as they are, and all of them have a specific purpose. So natural theology, since science was affected by religion, the original plan was, let's figure out what God or the Creator's plan was. If we study nature, if we classify nature, if we see any similarities or understand all the animals in the world, we could sort of figure out what his plan, the Creator's plan was. The second, after Aristotle, someone called Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, and he is the founder of taxonomy. And if you don't know what taxonomy is, it's the organization of all the animals. They use something called binomial nomenclature. Binomial meaning two, and nomenclature being name. So if you've ever been to the zoo or a museum or an aquarium, you may notice that animals, after you give the name of it that we know, like shark, they give sort of like a scientific term. Okay. How does he do that? He organized it in basically a large spectrum and sort of narrowed it down. You should have heard this in biology or some sort of science class before. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Or one of the cool acronyms, Dear King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So somehow you need to memorize this. This one's kind of silly. You might already know your own. And then the domains, the big overarching domains, that he first came up with eubacteria, which was a domain with, these are animals that don't have a nucleus. He came up with a third one called archaea. You may not have ever studied it before. They also don't have a nucleus. So these eubacteria and archaea serve together. And eukarya stands for organisms and cells that have a nucleus. So the three big domains, that's how he sort of separated the whole world of animals into these three domains. And he classified them by anatomy and morphology. So Linnaeus, try to remember Linnaeus. From Linnaeus, there's a paleontologist, his name is Cuvier, and what he did is he dug in, he was sort of a geologist. he dug in different layers. The layers are called strata. And he noticed that every time I digged in a different layer, the animal fossils were like very different after each layer. Even though he saw this, he sort of opposed the idea of evolution. Like, he didn't agree with the idea of evolution. He believed in something called catastrophism, which is like catastrophe, some sort of catastrophe like lightning or an earthquake. It destroys many living species, and then a new immigrant species sort of takes over. So instead of talking about like all of us coming from the same ancestor, he was talking about like, oh, here, giant earthquake, all the animals are dead, and then these new animals came and they lived, and something killed them, and then these new animals came. Not that they were all are related. So talking about strata, in case you're sort of need a visual. So if I looked at sedimentary rock, and this one's underneath the ocean, each different layer has a different type of different fossil set. The younger the stratum, or the higher it is to the surface, there are more recent fossils or more animals that we could recognize. But the older, the more deeper we go, the fossils were older and like more unrecognizable. Two other people that you need to know, these are also geologists, two of them, Hutton and Lyle, each with their own sort of different take on things, and they had two different thoughts that sort of contributed to what we know today. Hutton believed in gradualism, and this has nothing to do with animals. He just noticed that in the world, he noticed that geologic change, or the earth changes, is from slow, gradual, continuous process. So, for example, if you see a river, like that river did not just happen overnight. It took millions of years. Like the water like slowly degraded the dirt, and after millions of years, like it was a slow, gradual. Now I have this big river, or now I have the Grand Canyon. Lyle, sort of a similar thought process. He believed in something called the uniformitarianism, and he was saying that every process, past, present, now, they're all the same rate of. It's all the same speed. So before, they used to think that the Earth was like very young, like it was only 1,000 years old or whatever. But if it takes a long time to make the river, then there was a long time to make that river. So Lyle proposed that all the rates are the same, and that Earth has to be very, very old. Darwin, sort of combining these, remember these has nothing to do with animals or evolution. He said that maybe that's sort of the same thing with organisms. Like maybe we slowly change, very subtly, very slowly, just like the Earth. And then one day it becomes a big change, just like it is on the Earth. Then came Lamarck. Lamarck is sort of like the predecessor to Darwin. So if you want to think about somebody that published the theory, he published this theory of evolution the same year that Darwin was born. So he was like, we consider Darwin the father of evolution, but technically he's the father because he was the one before Darwin, but his theory was proven to be incorrect. His main theories was that use and disuse. He said the parts of body used, after years, they sort of became bigger and stronger. So if you use it a lot, it gets bigger and stronger. Sort of makes sense. Like if you weight lift, then you get bigger and stronger. So he was saying, take a giraffe's neck. So a giraffe, it needs food from really high places, and its necks got stronger. So then they got bigger, etc., etc., etc. And then once they get a strong neck, like this giraffe's like, oh, I got the super strong neck, it passes on these characteristics. Now all my offspring will have a strong neck. Sort of true, sort of not true. And his importance was saying that even though, the important thing about Lamarck's work is that he sort of recognized that species do evolve. But his explanation, this use and disuse, was flawed. That didn't really jive with what the people were saying. And the last one, Malthus. And these are all, everybody I've talked about, these are all like what led up to the great discoveries of Darwin. Malthus had nothing to do with evolution or geology or animals. He just noticed that in populations of the human race, that we have this tendency to over-reproduce or overpopulate. Like if we have enough people, we just tend to have more offspring than our environment can support. So more babies are born than deaths. And with all this overproducing, we have very great catastrophes like war, famine, disease, etc. And we have the struggle for existence. And it doesn't make sense now, but when I talk about Darwin in the next couple of videos, it sort of makes sense like why his theory had to have evolved, quote unquote, for Darwin's thing to make sense. So that's standard number 1. Know all of these people, all these traditional views, and I mean, this particular section isn't that they were challenged, but you should know these traditional views that Darwin actually challenged. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.